Hi y'all, I'm Pixie, also known as Asenath Waite or the Lament Butterfly, and welcome to the fourth in my series of Friday the 13th deep dive videos. I'm sorry for the lack of content this past month. I've been going through some personal stuff that's taken up most of my time and energy, but now I'm trying to get back to what makes me happy, and exploring Friday the 13th is one of my favorite things to do. This might be the oddest of my video essays, and it's probably the most theoretical, but I'm going to try to delve into what I believe Jason is and why he is what he is. This is mostly mere pure conjecture upon my part, but it is what I believe after watching the Friday the 13th films uncountable times, reading the associated novels and comics, and trying to make sense of them. First off, as usual, I am discounting Friday the 13th Part 9, Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday. I consider it to be a lore breaker. Nowhere in the previous films was there any indication that Jason was the victim of a family curse, a vessel for a body-hopping demon slug, or anything like that. In fact, the changes in his appearance from film to film are easily explained, and that's likely to be the subject of my next video. There's no need to resort to new bodies to make sense of that, and it felt cheap and forced to me. Neither is he some sort of super deadite, as far as I can tell. As fun as some aspects of Jason Goes to Hell and the comic Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash are, these just do not work with the previous films and the character introduced in Friday the 13th Part 2. Additionally, I'm discounting what we read about the Voorhees family in the comic book Pamela's Tale for the same reasons why I discounted it in my Elias Voorhees video. It's probably a good idea to watch that video before this one, as I do go into some of the metaphysics surrounding Jason therein, and I prefer not to repeat myself too much. Also, I'm not trying to insult the aforementioned works or their creators, but I've never accepted them for the reasons I've explained in previous videos. Now, if you haven't watched my video addressing how I make sense of Jason being seen as a little boy by Alice Hardy at the end of Part 1, then as a grown man at the beginning of Part 2, which takes place mere months later, I recommend watching it as well before watching this, as it addresses when and how I believe he was resurrected in some detail. The metaphysics surrounding his first resurrection are critical to understanding just what Jason is. In short, though, I believe that Jason died when he drowned in 1957, and that he was resurrected when Pamela killed Barry and Claudette in revenge the next summer. This belief is strongly supported by the Part 2 novelization by Simon Hawke, in which he writes, "It did not occur to Jason Voorhees to wonder just how long he had been underwater. He merely dragged himself deeper into the woods. Some primitive urge driving him to find a hole somewhere that he could crawl into, a dark place where he could rest and heal and wait until he could think of what to do. After a while, he returned back to the camp, his simple mind telling him that perhaps it was what he was supposed to do. Only there was no longer anybody there. The season had ended, and the camp was closed. He broke into several of the cabins and found some cans of food and some old clothes for himself. In the process, he happened to catch sight of himself in a mirror, and he recoiled in horror from the image that confronted him. He had been at the bottom of the lake for much longer than he realized. His flesh was trying to regenerate and heal itself, but decomposition had set in. The worms had eaten his face." Bits of Jason's story like this are why I've always felt sympathy for him despite the killing. So now, on to the analysis. First, it is necessary to have some understanding of why Jason was resurrected at all. I do not believe that Jason's resurrection was mere happenstance. Rather, it was a convergence of multiple factors: natural, unnatural, and supernatural, most, if not all of which had to be present for the dead child to be returned from the lake. The first and most obvious factor in creating the Jason who we know and love is Pamela Voorhees. She and Jason were as close as a mother and child could be, and she devoted her life to her son, losing him to the negligence of the irresponsible teenage counselors who were charged with his care could have been enough to break her mind, but there were two things that made it worse. First, they never recovered Jason's body, so she never got that very important closure, which would have kept the wound to her soul open during all the years that passed. Second, and likely more significant to this particular analysis, not only was Camp Crystal Lake reopened the very next summer after Jason drowned, but Barry and Claudette, the very counselors who had been making love while that young boy drowned, as Pamela put it, were hired back to watch over children again, in spite of the fatal consequences of their selfish negligence only 1 year earlier. This was far worse than merely adding insult to injury. Pamela was not only avenging her loss when she killed the pair that summer, she was, in her own grief-warped way, preventing a similar tragedy from touching another family as well. Especially in the modern era, it is outside of the order of nature for a child to die before the parent. But even in earlier times, once a child reached late pre-adolescence/early adolescence, the risks that cause the high infant mortality rate faded. Once a child makes it to 11 years old, as Jason had by the time of his death, the chances of them reaching adulthood alive are almost as high as they can get. As far as we as human beings have tried to remove ourselves from nature and to declare ourselves sovereign thereover, at the core, we remain animals, and nature still controls. Because it is so contrary to the natural order within which we exist and by which we make sense of our lives and surroundings. And this order is what allows us to see the patterns by which we can maintain our sanity in the face of reality. A child predeceasing its parents is especially traumatizing. For example, a high percentage of marriages do not survive the loss of a child, counterintuitive though that might seem upon the surface, as who else would be better suited to relate to and support through that pain than another who knows it and shares it. But aspects of memory and blame, along with that pain, rip them apart. When that death was sudden and unexpected, its destructive power can only be magnified. When that death was completely preventable and is due to irresponsibility and carelessness, suddenly all of the pain and anger at an event contrary to the natural order has a target. Pain and anger, the burning need for revenge for what was stolen from her, consumed Pamela, destroying the remarkably selfless woman and loving mother who she had been up until the moment her child was taken from her by death. And something else, something feral and dangerous, arose from the ashes of who she had been before the unspeakable tragedy. When the owners reopened Camp Crystal Lake the next summer and rehired the pair of counselors responsible for Jason's death, Pamela's pain and anger gained a target. Instead of her life being devoted to her son, as it had been since she became a mother at age 16, all of that powerful emotion was redirected to two related goals: to exact revenge upon those who had let Jason die, and to keep the camp closed in order to prevent any more such accidents from destroying any more families. She was successful in this endeavor for 20 years, setting fires, poisoning the water supply, and more. But in the 21st year, Steve Christie stubbornly ignored all of the bad things that had occurred upon the land and succeeded in bringing in a new generation of counselors who would be responsible for the safety of children. Perhaps if she had observed the would-be counselors demonstrating responsible behavior, Pamela would not have been compelled to kill them. But honestly, it seems equally, if not more likely, that it would not have made a difference that fatal Friday the 13th. However, they did not, instead engaging in dangerous pranks, drinking, having sex, and generally behaving just like Barry and Claudette had so many years before. And in her fractured mind, Camp Crystal Lake absolutely could not be allowed to reopen. The place was her lost son's unmarked grave, the place where his lost body remained hidden away by the cruelty of fate, and the combination of risk to other children with the desecration of a place so sacred to her was unacceptable. She had to watch the counselors behaving just like Barry and Claudette had that fateful summer, and being generally careless, which only would have brought her back to the darkest, bleakest moments in her life, and therefore heightened her emotions. And lest we forget, emotions have power, especially in a place marked by violent and premature death. Pamela exacting her revenge upon those most directly responsible for her son's death in 1958, what amounted to a blood sacrifice performed at a point of emotion heightened behind what most humans ever experience, one performed in that place, was enough to drag Jason's corpse forth from the lake, to fill his dead, decaying lungs with air instead of water, and to set his still heart back to beating once more, to breathe a semblance of life into that broken body. However, he was not fully returned to the realm of the living thereby. All of that pain and loss and drive to protect and avenge remained housed within Pamela. A veil of sorts separated Jason from the world at large, keeping that which was alive but had been dead apart from the truly living. And during that time, Jason Voorhees was forged by nature and death into what he became. As Jason was already returned from the lake when Pamela went on her final killing spree on June 13, 1979, those deaths had little impact upon him or his situation. It would take more than the deaths of would-be counselors to rend the veil separating the living from the once dead. Alice beheading Pamela, spilling the blood that had been pumped by a broken heart through a body that grieved to the point of madness into the sand beside the lake whose water had filled Jason's body, pouring vengeance and pain and death into the cursed earth. That is what tore through the veil and allowed Jason fully to re-enter the realm of the living. That is what freed him to fulfill the roles for which he had been reborn. However, there was more to what dredged Jason back from death than just Pamela's love, grief, and the blood that she spilt in his name. Jason himself was different, special, from the very beginning. Not only was he Pamela's son, but the eerily uncanny and even frightening Elias Voorhees' blood flowed through his veins. As we saw in the Part 6 novelization, Elias was extraordinary in his own right, as was demonstrated clearly at the end of the book when we get to see his ability to sense not only that his son's body no longer rested in its grave, but that Jason was miles away from the cemetery and in the lake once again, where Tommy Jarvis had trapped him in chains. As Pamela was wont to say in happier times, Jason is his father's son. Therefore, this was not a case of an ordinary child drowning. There always was some sort of otherness to the boy. If not for whatever it was that he inherited from Elias, it is unlikely that even Pamela's emotions, coupled with the blood sacrifice of those responsible for her loss, could have resurrected Jason. Another factor contributing to Jason returning from death is Crystal Lake itself. According to the comic Badlands, it was built upon a place of madness, violence, and death stretching back to a time long before Jason drowned or Pamela first killed. And places are not mere things. They can have a character. They can be warped or scarred by events, just as we can be. You needn't even be particularly sensitive to feel just how deep those scars can run in certain places, particularly those where terrible events have occurred. One of my favorite descriptions of this phenomenon can be found in the short story, The Book of Blood, wherein the marvelously brilliant and absolutely amazing author Clive Barker writes of the house at 65 Tollington Place, where an intersection upon the highways of the dead exists. He writes, "The dead have highways. They run, unerring lines of ghost trains, of dream carriages across the wasteland behind our lives, bearing an endless traffic of departed souls. Their thrum and throb can be heard in the broken places of the world, through cracks made by acts of cruelty, violence, and depravity. Their freight, the wandering dead, can be glimpsed when the heart is close to bursting, and sights that should be hidden come plainly into view. They have signposts, these highways, and bridges and lay-bys. They have turnpikes and intersections. It is at these intersections, where the crowds of dead mingle and cross, that this forbidden highway is most likely to spill through into our world. The traffic is heavy at the crossroads, and the voices of the dead are at their most shrill. Here, the barriers that separate one reality from the next are worn thin with the passage of innumerable feet. Barker's story continues, explaining the effect of violent death upon such a place. At some time in history, a horror had been committed in that house. No one knew when or what, but even to the untrained observer, the oppressive atmosphere of the house, particularly the top story, was unmistakable. There was a memory and a promise of blood in the air of number 65, a scent that lingered in the sinuses and turned the strongest stomach. The building and its environs were shunned by vermin, by birds, even by flies. No woodlice crawled in the kitchen. No starling had nested in its attic. Whatever violence had been done there, it had opened the house up, as surely as a knife slits a fish's belly, and through that cut, that wound in the world, the dead peered out and had their say. The 1983 film Eyes of Fire also addresses a similar phenomenon. Marion, the film's protagonist, Fanny Dalton's father, and a trapper who truly knows nature, explains, "Some Indians believe that the devil is a dark angel who lives someplace else, way down below. They look on it as a natural thing, as natural as a brook or a tree. Their devil is born of earth, a part of nature, thriving on the evil half of life. Everything that's good has an evil side to it. To live and breed, the mantis has to kill the fly, the hawk has to kill the sparrow. I killed that rabbit, and I'm going to eat it. I'm fed, but the rabbit's dead." Some believe that every time innocent blood is spilt, it sinks into the earth and joins in particular spots with the blood of other victims who died before it, until finally the souls of the slaughtered creatures gather together into a breathing spirit. A devil. Marion's definitions of evil and devil here are not what most people think when they hear those terms. He's referring to the deaths of innocents, even if those deaths are part of the natural order and provide sustenance and life to other creatures, as a sort of evil. And the devil that he describes is the dangerous side of nature given form. I believe that Crystal Lake is a similar sort of place to that haunted house of unknown, unremembered violence in the Book of Blood, or the abandoned valley of the Devil Tree, where those who fled with Pastor Will Smythe thought to settle in Eyes of Fire, and that Jason is the very sort of devil that Marion described. Not a devil in the Christian sense, but a living spirit born of innocent death, and that Crystal Lake is a place that belongs to nature and death, not to man. A place where the plains inhabited by the living and the dead exist in far closer proximity to one another than elsewhere. And once man was exiled from that section of Crystal Lake by Pamela's actions, which got the camp shut down and kept it closed for over 2 decades, the land itself could not allow humans to return. Well, at least not without punishing those who dared to return for their trespass. Jason, being neither dead nor a part of the realm of the living, existed for over 20 years upon that very sort of intersection described in the Book of Blood by Clive Barker. One walked by the dead, yet bleeding into the realm of the living. This also would explain Crazy Ralph's insistence that Camp Crystal Lake is under a death curse, and it might even explain the extremes such as poisoning the water supply and murder, to which Pamela went in order to ensure that people, especially children, would never return. Badlands cements the fact that blood was spilled upon the hungry earth beside the lake in terrible ways for centuries before children's summer camps were conceptualized by entrepreneurs. What is not clear, however, is whether it was the long-ago first massacre that polluted the land and invited death to stay, or whether it was something intrinsic to the land itself, something that predated man's arrival, that drove the perpetrator to commit the first murder upon that soil. And this begs the question, was it entirely Pamela's grief and anger that drove her to kill, or had some inhuman power nesting deep and silent, yet unfelt, within the place where her son died, sensed her emotional state and compelled her to act out her bloody vengeance. My personal view hereupon is fluid, changing with my mood, but regardless of how much, if any, influence the land had upon Pamela's actions, I do believe that the land itself was intrinsic in returning Jason from death, and in the role that he performed after the invisible yet impenetrable veil was torn away and he fully re-entered the realm of the living, despite not being entirely alive in the normal sense of the term. Well, now that I've fully established how I believe that Jason was resurrected and the conjunction of improbable factors that allowed this otherwise impossible event to occur, asking the question of the purpose of his return from death is the next logical step in this analysis. So, what was Jason resurrected to be? I consider Jason simultaneously to be several things. Upon the moment of his mother's violent death, he inherited her drive for vengeance, her drive to keep the camp from reopening, becoming vengeance incarnate. However, whilst that is a significant part of his motivation, he is far more than just that. At his very core, I believe Jason to be a personification of the conjunction of nature and death that exists at Camp Crystal Lake. A devil in the eyes of fire sense of the term. He is the guardian of the cursed land where he and his mother died, and he guards it against the living. For this reason, I do not really consider Jason to be a murderer, even though he is a killer. The term murderer implies a degree of humanity that I simply do not believe he possesses, and a degree of culpability that cannot rightly be ascribed to him. Nature itself is intrinsically, inherently dangerous. It has no morality, no concept of good and evil as humans define these concepts. Nobody would call a wolf who kills a man who ventures into its den a murderer, even though it is a killer. Neither would they call it evil for doing what a wolf does. And therefore, I've never considered Jason to be evil, despite the number of people who he has killed. Jason is more like that wolf, and Camp Crystal Lake is his territory. To venture onto his land is to incite the dangerous, deadly side of nature to react to that trespass, and that dangerous side of nature is personified in his semi-living form. It's the arrogance of modern man that leads us to intrude upon nature's realm, as if our weapons and intelligence are sufficient protections against a force far greater than we are. We try to sanitize and remove the dangers from our surroundings, but we cannot do this completely, and all that we wind up doing is pushing those dangers into smaller and smaller areas that encroach upon the ground that we have conquered and claimed. And nature does fight back against the intrusion of humans into areas where we ought not to wander with impunity. Deadly viruses like Ebola, Marburg, Lassa, and hantavirus emerge from the forest and the desert when people venture too far into nature's realm, into places where we should not be. Wild animals attack when we venture into their territory. Yet, for all that these are killers, we do not call them murderers. The more rational people do not even blame them for the deaths that they cause, because what they are, they cannot be held accountable as a human being responsible for the deaths of his fellow men would be. Yes, in some senses, Jason very much is a man, and he makes good use of the abilities conveyed by his human intellect and the dexterity and other capabilities of his human body. However, his completely isolated upbringing in a place where nature has reclaimed her land, alongside having died and risen again, and the fact that he never was entirely normal, place him well outside of the bounds of humanity. Much as Jason is neither entirely alive nor entirely dead, he is neither entirely human nor entirely inhuman. Further, the more times he dies, the more his humanity seems to fade, and therefore the more dangerous he becomes. The last time we truly see him trying to defend himself against his victims when they attempt to stop him via violence, as opposed to continuing his attacks without any hesitation, is in Part 4, until the confrontation with the psychokinetic Tina Shepard in Part 7. And there, Jason was not going up against a mere person, but against a fellow force of nature incarnate, a fellow killer touched by tragedy and the supernatural, an elemental power housed within deceptively human form. Further proof of Jason's otherness can be seen in a comparison to Angela Baker of the Sleepaway Camp films, or even to his own mother. Unlike them, it is obvious from his behavior that Jason does not make moral judgments about his victims. If a person past puberty enters the land he haunts, then he will make every attempt to kill them. It clearly does not matter to him if the trespassers engage in sex, drinking, illegal drug use, or any other irresponsible behavior, even though most do. Simply coming to the site where Camp Crystal Lake was located is irresponsible enough to warrant a visit from death. Only young children, as young as Jason himself was when he died or younger, and animals in their innocence, are safe there. This actually gives rise to a question about why the vast majority of the people who come to Crystal Lake engage in risky behavior. Does the land call to a certain type of person? Or does it bring out the worst in weak but otherwise decent people? I might need to do a separate video on Camp Crystal Lake itself at some point, but if it's not totally obvious, I consider Jason and the land itself to be inextricably entwined. They are two parts of the same single power. To me, Jason's homing instinct is about the best evidence of the connection betwixt the land and its guardian. At the end of Part 3, Chris Higgins embedded a hatchet in his skull, and at the outset of Part 4, his body is brought by ambulance to the hospital morgue. From the films in which we see people driving to the camp, it is clear that it is several miles away from the town center of Crystal Lake or the more populous areas of Wessex County. Even so, once Jason arises in the morgue and slaughters Axel Burns and Robbie Morgan, and maybe more people in the hospitals whose deaths we don't even see, he immediately begins walking back towards the lake, without a map, without even having been conscious to see the routes that the ambulance took. Similarly, in Part 6, after Tommy accidentally resurrected him once more, Jason almost immediately begins to walk from the cemetery to the camp. Sadly, there is no official Part 4 novelization to describe how Jason found his way back home from the morgue. But there is one for Part 6. In it, author Simon Hawke writes, "As if following a ritual, Jason Voorhees slowly donned the hockey mask. He turned away from the open grave, from the closed coffin that now held the torn and broken body of Alan Hawes, and, still holding the iron spear, the alchemist's rod that had brought him back to life, Jason started walking towards the cemetery gates. Just as something had been pulling Tommy Jarvis back to the Eternal Rest Cemetery, so something now pulled at Jason Voorhees, something that pulled him to follow a blind homing instinct and return to the place where it all began." It does not appear from this description that Jason is thinking about returning to the only home that he has known for decades, or that to do so is a desire, as we would understand it. The land simply calls to her undead son, to her protector, and he obeys. Additionally, it seems to be quite clear that Jason and the land itself would prefer to be left alone. In Part 2, Jason dragged most of a fallen tree quite some distance to block the road leading to his territory in an attempt to prevent trespassers from entering his domain, even though he could have waited there and killed those who came. Additionally, he did not kill any of the trainees at the Packanack Lodge Counselor Training Center until Sandra and Jeff wandered onto the abandoned Camp Crystal Lake property, thereby dooming nearly everyone there. This makes perfect sense when you consider it from Jason's point of view. If two people trespassed upon his land despite the barriers to entrance, he could not be certain that others would not do the same. With the exception of his trip into town to kill Alice Hardy, it is only once Jason had to flee his land in the aftermath of the slaughter at Packanack that the killing radius expanded significantly. People had proven to him that they could not even be trusted near his territory. Nobody who he saw could be allowed to live. And I believe that this is because he viewed it as a risk that they would follow him. Chris Higgins, who had already intruded upon his territory once years earlier, returned with friends to Crystal Lake. Humans are what made Jason more and more dangerous. Prior to Chris and then Sandra and Jeff trespassing, the only time that he left the abandoned camp was to exact his revenge upon the girl who killed his mother. I'm not planning to go too deep into his psychology in this video, but the reason why I've included this little bit is that it demonstrates that Jason displays the same behavior as nature itself does when people intrude upon it. Nature is only dangerous to humankind when we trespass upon it. But once we go past the boundaries of the civilized realm that we have claimed and from which we have excluded as much natural threat as possible, the dangers can follow us out of their world and into ours. To me, one of the most interesting questions is, did the lake keep Jason on purpose? In other words, was there some supernatural reason why the divers never found the little boy's corpse after he drowned? Were he and his mother chosen by that cursed place, perhaps due to Pamela's extreme devotion to her son and her emotional fragility, or maybe because of Jason's uniqueness, or both? Could the lake even have lured him to venture out into its dark depths that night, even though he was not a strong swimmer, and pulled him under? Even if Barry and Claudette had not been distracted by each other, could Jason have been rescued? Was all of the suffering, all of the bloodshed and tragedy, set into motion by some completely inhuman consciousness, some force beyond our comprehension? Was it fated to be, utterly unavoidable? Additionally, there is the question of whether Jason is alive or dead. The answer to this simply is yes. From my research, it seems pretty certain to me that Jason died when he drowned in 1957, which means that he is dead. However, he walks around, thinks, breathes, bleeds, things that the dead are not capable of doing. We see him bleed in nearly every film. We see and even occasionally hear him react to pain. Even at his most decayed, we clearly see him breathing. And in Freddy vs. Jason, we see incontrovertible proof that his heart still beats within his partially skeletonized chest. Thus, he is both alive and dead. Or perhaps he is neither alive nor dead. He is a being of will and vengeance and flesh and bone, pure and certain, perfect and terrible. He is, for all the horror and danger and death that he embodies, like the most dangerous aspects of nature. Grand waterfalls, tigers in their lush jungles, the black depths that beckon with their unseen secrets. Intriguing, fascinating, and even beautiful. Something that draws the eye and the imagination, but which should never be approached by humankind, because to do so is to welcome death itself to come dancing. Okay, this is getting absolutely ridiculously long, so I think I'll have to do another video where I explore what I believe and wonder about Crystal Lake itself, even though what Jason is completely tied up in what the camp is, and it's almost impossible to discuss one without discussing the other in this particular context. Well, apologies if the camera does not line up. It managed to overheat, so I needed to restart the end of this, but fortunately that was the end of the analysis, and all that's left is my summary and conclusion, so here we go. In summary, Jason is many things. He is a revenant, an undead spirit of revenge, the embodiment of a curse, the protector of that curse, and a personification of the most deadly aspects of nature itself. He is neither truly alive nor truly dead, or he is simultaneously both, and his very humanity is questionable, even though he is, for all intents and purposes, a man in most senses. Basically, he is an utterly fascinating being, as is everything surrounding him, and I'm probably insane for spending so much time thinking about all this. Hopefully, despite being almost entirely theoretical, unlike my previous videos, which have a more solid basis in the films and associated literature, this made sense, or as much sense as anything going so far into unprovable and metaphysical realms can make. I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions, so please comment. Also, if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. I'm going to try to upload a little bit more regularly in the future. And thanks for watching. Love y'all and keep it brutal. Thanks. And say hi to the murder monkey, because she's the cutest thing ever to live. Okay.